The sound of heavy golden doors slamming shut echoed through the marble corridors of Buckingham Palace on a cold October morning in 2019. For the first time in over a century, those doors would no longer open for everyone who once walked through them with royal privilege. Inside those walls, a decision had been made that would shake the very foundations of centuries-old traditions and leave some of the most powerful people in Britain standing on the wrong side of history. What started as a simple administrative review would end up rewriting the rules of royalty itself, creating winners and losers in a game where the stakes were nothing less than a place in the most exclusive family on Earth. Some would gain unprecedented access to power and prestige, while others would find themselves cast out from the golden circle they had always called home. This is the true story of how a palace changed its rules, how bloodlines became battle lines, and how the most traditional institution in the world made a decision that would echo through generations. It's a story of power, privilege, and the price of being royal in the modern age. The morning of October 15, 2019, began like any other at Buckingham Palace. The red-coated guards stood at their posts. Tourists gathered outside the iron gates with their cameras ready, and inside the palace walls, staff members went about their daily routines with the precision that had defined royal service for generations. But in a small, wood-paneled meeting room on the second floor, a conversation was taking place that would change everything. Sir Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, sat across from Lord Chamberlain Earl Peel and several other senior palace officials. The thick folder on the mahogany table contained months of research, legal documents, and historical precedents that had kept these men awake for countless nights. The topic of discussion was one that had been whispered about in royal circles for years, but never officially addressed. Who truly deserved the privileges of royal status in the 21st century? The catalyst for this unprecedented review had come 6 months earlier when a seemingly routine event had sparked a crisis of protocol. During the annual Trooping the Color ceremony, confusion had arisen about balcony appearances, seating arrangements, and the use of various palace entrances. Minor royals, distant cousins, and extended family members had traditionally enjoyed many of the same privileges as direct heirs to the throne. But as the royal family grew larger and more complex, the lines of distinction had become increasingly blurred. Queen Elizabeth II herself had requested this comprehensive review after witnessing the chaos firsthand. At 93 years old, she had seen her fair share of royal protocol disputes, but this felt different. The modern world demanded clarity, and the institution she had served for over 6 decades needed to adapt or risk becoming irrelevant. The weight of this decision pressed heavily on everyone in that room. Sir Edward opened the folder and began reading from the first page of recommendations. The proposal was radical by royal standards, yet simple in its execution. The golden entrance to Buckingham Palace, the most prestigious entryway traditionally reserved for the highest-ranking royals and visiting heads of state, would henceforth be exclusively available to direct members of the royal lineage. This meant only the sovereign, their spouse, their children, and their grandchildren would have access to this symbolic gateway. The immediate implications were staggering. Dozens of people who had spent their entire lives considering themselves full members of the royal family would suddenly find themselves relegated to lesser entrances. Cousins, nieces, nephews, and more distant relatives who had attended every major royal event, lived in grace and favor homes, and received annual allowances from the Crown estate would discover that their status had fundamentally changed overnight. Earl Peel raised the first objection, his weathered face showing concern that went beyond mere protocol. He had served the royal family for over a decade and understood the human cost of such decisions. Many of these peripheral royals had dedicated their lives to public service, attending charity events, cutting ribbons, and representing the crown at functions that the senior royals couldn't attend. They had sacrificed normal careers and private lives for the privilege of serving the monarchy. How could the palace now tell them that their service was no longer valued equally? The discussion that followed was intense and emotional. Legal advisors explained the constitutional implications, while historians provided context about similar decisions made by European monarchies in previous decades. The Scandinavian countries had successfully streamlined their royal families, and the Dutch monarchy had implemented similar restrictions with positive results. But Britain was different. The British royal family wasn't just a ceremonial institution. It was a global brand, a tourist attraction, and a symbol of national identity that generated billions in economic value. Sir Edward presented the financial arguments that had convinced the Treasury to support these changes. The cost of maintaining royal privileges for an ever-expanding family was becoming unsustainable. Security details, transportation, accommodation, and official functions for dozens of minor royals were draining resources that could be better allocated to supporting the working members of the monarchy. The numbers were stark. Reducing the number of people with full royal privileges could save the taxpayers millions of pounds annually while actually increasing the prestige and effectiveness of the core royal family. But the human drama unfolding behind palace walls was far more complex than mere financial calculations. Lady Sarah Chatto, the Queen's niece and daughter of Princess Margaret, had been one of the most beloved members of the extended royal family. She had maintained a relatively low profile while still fulfilling royal duties with grace and dignity. Under the new rules, her access to the golden entrance would be revoked, along with several other ceremonial privileges she had enjoyed since birth. The Earl of Snowdon, Princess Margaret's son, faced an even more dramatic change in status. David Armstrong Jones had carved out a successful career as a furniture maker, while still maintaining his royal connections and obligations. He had always understood his place in the hierarchy, but the new rules would create a visible and permanent separation between him and his royal cousins, who happened to be in the direct line of succession. The ripple effects extended to the Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Kent, both grandsons of King George V, who had served the crown faithfully for decades. These elderly gentlemen had performed thousands of royal engagements, supported countless charities, and represented the monarchy at events around the world. The thought of reducing their status felt like a betrayal of their lifetime of service, yet the new rules made no exceptions for past contributions. Behind the formal discussions and legal documents, a more personal struggle was taking place. The Queen herself was torn between her duty to modernize the monarchy and her loyalty to family members who had never asked to be born into royal life but had embraced their responsibilities nonetheless. She had watched some of these relatives grow from children into dedicated public servants, and she knew that this decision would cause genuine pain and confusion. The palace staff members who would be responsible for implementing these changes were equally conflicted. Many had worked with the affected royals for years, developing professional relationships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the crown. They knew that explaining the new protocols would require delicate diplomacy and probably result in some uncomfortable confrontations. The security implications alone were enormous. The golden entrance wasn't just a ceremonial gateway. It was part of a carefully designed security system that had evolved over decades. Changing the access rules would require retraining personnel, updating protocols, and potentially redesigning parts of the palace's security infrastructure. The Metropolitan Police Unit responsible for royal protection would need to adjust their procedures and possibly reduce the security details for those royals who lost their privileged status. Media management became another crucial consideration. The British press had always been fascinated by royal hierarchy and protocol, and any changes to traditional arrangements would inevitably become front-page news. The palace communications team knew that they would need to carefully control the narrative to prevent the story from being portrayed as a family feud or a sign of internal discord. International implications also weighed heavily on the decision-makers. Foreign dignitaries and heads of state were accustomed to specific protocols when visiting Britain, and any changes would need to be communicated through diplomatic channels. The risk of causing offense or confusion during state visits could have serious consequences for Britain's international relationships. As the meeting progressed into the afternoon, the reality of the situation became increasingly clear. Despite the emotional and practical challenges, the modernization of the royal family was inevitable. The question was no longer whether to implement these changes, but how to do so with dignity and minimal disruption to the institution's public image. The final decision was made with the understanding that it would be irreversible. Once the new protocols were announced, there would be no going back to the old system without appearing indecisive and weak. The monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years by adapting to changing circumstances, and this decision represented another evolutionary step in that long history. Sir Edward closed the folder and looked around the room at his colleagues. Each man understood the weight of what they had just approved. Within weeks, letters would be sent to affected family members. Staff would be briefed on new procedures, and centuries of tradition would be quietly but permanently altered. The golden entrance would become a more exclusive gateway, reserved only for those whose bloodlines ran directly to the throne. The meeting ended with handshakes and solemn nods, but everyone present knew that the real work was just beginning. The implementation of these changes would test the loyalty, discretion, and professionalism of everyone involved in the royal household. Some relationships would be strained, some feelings would be hurt, and some traditions would be lost forever. As the officials filed out of the meeting room, the palace continued its daily operations, unaware that a fundamental shift had just been approved. The tourists outside still gathered hopefully for glimpses of royalty. The guards still stood at their posts, and life went on as it always had. But inside those ancient walls, the wheels of change had been set in motion, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The letters arrived on a gray November morning, delivered by personal courier to addresses across London and the British countryside. Each envelope bore the distinctive royal cipher and was marked private and confidential. Inside, written on the finest palace stationery, was a carefully worded notification that would fundamentally alter the lives of its recipients forever. Lady Sarah Chatto was arranging flowers in her Kensington home when her letter arrived. She had been expecting correspondence about an upcoming charity event, but the formal tone and official seal immediately caught her attention. As she read the contents, her hands began to tremble slightly. The letter explained, in diplomatic language, that effective January 1, 2020, certain protocols regarding palace access and ceremonial privileges would be modified to reflect the current structure of the monarchy. The words were polite and respectful, but their meaning was unmistakable. After 55 years of life as a working member of the royal family, her status was being quietly but definitively reduced. The golden entrance would no longer be available to her. Certain ceremonial roles would be reassigned, and her position in the order of precedence would be adjusted accordingly. The letter thanked her for her years of faithful service and assured her that her contributions to the crown would always be valued, but it was clear that an era had ended. Similar scenes were playing out across the country as other members of the extended royal family received their own letters. The Duke of Gloucester, at 75 years old, read his notification with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He had served the crown for over 4 decades, attending countless engagements and supporting dozens of organizations. He had always known that his role was supplementary to the main line of succession, but seeing it formalized in writing was still a profound shock. His wife, the Duchess of Gloucester, found the news particularly difficult to process. She had spent her entire married life adapting to the demands of royal protocol, learning the intricate rules of precedence, dress codes, and ceremonial procedures. The thought of explaining to the organizations they patroned that their royal status had been diminished felt deeply embarrassing and potentially damaging to causes they genuinely cared about. The Earl of Snowdon received his letter while working in his furniture workshop, his hands covered in wood stain and sawdust. David Armstrong Jones had always managed to balance his artistic career with his royal obligations, but the formal notification that his palace access was being restricted felt like a door closing on an important part of his identity. He had grown up understanding that he was different from other children, that he carried responsibilities and privileges that came with his bloodline. Now, at 57 years old, he was being told that those differences were no longer significant enough to warrant full royal recognition. The practical implications of these changes began to emerge almost immediately. Charity organizations that had relied on the prestige of royal patronage from these extended family members suddenly found themselves in an awkward position. Would donations decrease if their royal patron was no longer considered a full member of the royal family? Would media coverage of their events diminish? Would corporate sponsors reconsider their support? The Royal National Institute of Blind People had been supported by the Duke of Gloucester for over 30 years. His dedication to their cause had been unwavering, and his presence at their fundraising events had consistently attracted significant donations and media attention. When news of the protocol changes began to leak, the charity's leadership worried that their royal connection might be perceived as less valuable, potentially affecting their ability to raise funds for vital services. Similar concerns arose at dozens of other charitable organizations across Britain. The Princess Royals Trust for Carers had been founded with the support of several minor royals, and their involvement had been crucial to its success. The Deborah Charity, which supported people with the genetic skin condition epidermolysis bullosa, had relied on the Duke of Kent's patronage for decades. These organizations now faced the challenge of maintaining their royal connections while adapting to the reduced status of their patrons. Palace staff members found themselves in equally difficult positions. Many had worked closely with the affected royals for years, developing professional relationships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to public service. Suddenly, they were required to treat these same individuals differently, implementing new protocols that created visible distinctions between family members who had previously been treated as equals. The Queen's personal staff were particularly conflicted. Many had watched some of these relatives grow from children into dedicated public servants. They had seen Lady Sarah Chatto support her mother, Princess Margaret, through difficult times while maintaining her own dignified public presence. They had witnessed the Duke of Gloucester's unwavering commitment to his duties even as he aged and his health declined. The thought of enforcing protocols that diminished these individuals felt personally uncomfortable. Security arrangements required immediate attention and significant reorganization. The Metropolitan Police Unit, responsible for royal protection, had to reassess threat levels and adjust their procedures accordingly. Some members of the extended royal family would no longer require the same level of security coverage, which meant reassigning personnel and potentially reducing protection details that had been in place for years. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Morrison, who had coordinated royal security for over a decade, found herself managing a complex transition that went far beyond simple protocol changes. Each member of the royal family had unique security requirements based on their profile, their activities, and their potential exposure to threats. Reducing someone's royal status didn't automatically reduce their security risks, particularly if the change itself generated negative publicity or public sympathy. The logistical challenges extended to transportation arrangements, accommodation bookings, and event planning. Royal staff members who had spent years coordinating complex schedules and managing intricate protocols suddenly found themselves implementing a two-tiered system that required constant attention to detail. The risk of accidentally treating someone according to their old status, or failing to provide appropriate recognition for their new position, created additional stress for everyone involved. Media speculation began almost immediately, despite the palace's attempts to keep the changes quiet. Royal correspondents who had covered the family for decades noticed subtle differences in seating arrangements, entrance procedures, and ceremonial protocols. The absence of certain family members from traditional positions during public events became a source of intense scrutiny and analysis. The Daily Mail's royal correspondent, Rebecca English, was among the first to report on the emerging pattern of changes. Her sources within the palace confirmed that significant protocol adjustments were underway, but the official line remained that these were routine administrative updates designed to streamline operations. The palace communications team worked overtime to prevent the story from being portrayed as a family conflict or a sign of internal problems. International media attention added another layer of complexity to the situation. European royal correspondents, particularly those familiar with similar modernization efforts in other monarchies, began drawing comparisons between Britain's approach and the strategies employed by royal families in Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands. Some praised the British approach as overdue modernization, while others criticized it as unnecessarily harsh treatment of loyal family members. The affected royals themselves handled the situation with characteristic dignity and discretion. Public statements were minimal and carefully worded, emphasizing continued commitment to their charitable work and gratitude for the opportunity to serve the crown. Behind the scenes, however, conversations were more complex and emotionally charged. Lady Sarah Chatto confided to close friends that she felt somewhat betrayed by the decision, not because she had expected special treatment, but because the changes seemed to dismiss decades of faithful service. She had never sought the spotlight, had never caused scandal or embarrassment, and had consistently fulfilled her royal duties with quiet competence. The reduction in her status felt like punishment for sins she had never committed. The Duke of Kent's reaction was more philosophical. At 84 years old, he had lived through tremendous changes in the monarchy and understood the need for evolution. His military background had taught him the importance of adapting to new circumstances, and he accepted the decision as necessary for the institution's survival. However, he worried about the impact on younger members of the extended family who might feel discouraged from public service. Private conversations between affected family members revealed a range of emotions and concerns. Some felt relief at being freed from certain obligations and expectations, while others experienced genuine grief at the loss of their traditional roles. The change represented more than just protocol adjustments. It was a fundamental redefinition of identity and purpose for people who had built their lives around royal service. The Queen herself was not immune to the emotional weight of these decisions. She met privately with each affected family member, expressing her personal gratitude for their service, while explaining the reasoning behind the changes. These conversations were among the most difficult of her reign, requiring her to balance her roles as sovereign and family member in ways that tested her legendary composure. Prince Charles, as heir to the throne, supported the modernization efforts while acknowledging their personal cost. He understood that similar decisions would likely be necessary throughout his future reign, and he used this experience to develop frameworks for managing such transitions with greater sensitivity and clarity. The ripple effects continued to spread throughout the royal household and beyond. Staff members adapted to new procedures, charitable organizations adjusted their expectations, and the media continued to analyze every detail for signs of conflict or controversy. The palace maintained its official position that these were routine administrative changes, but everyone involved understood that they represented a fundamental shift in how the monarchy would operate in the 21st century. As winter settled over London, the new reality began to take shape. The golden entrance remained as magnificent as ever, but its exclusivity had been reinforced in ways that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. The first major test of the new protocols came during the Christmas celebrations of 2019, just weeks after the letters had been sent. The annual Christmas Day service at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, had always been a carefully choreographed display of royal unity and tradition. This year, however, the subtle but significant changes in arrangements would be visible to millions of viewers worldwide. Television producers and royal correspondents noticed immediately that the seating arrangements had been quietly modified. Members of the extended royal family who had traditionally sat in the front rows found themselves positioned further back, while the direct line of succession was prominently featured in the most visible locations. The changes were implemented with such subtlety that casual viewers might not have noticed, but royal watchers understood the significance immediately. Lady Sarah Chatto handled the adjustment with characteristic grace, taking her new position without any visible sign of displeasure. However, those who knew her well could see the slight tension in her posture and the careful control she maintained over her facial expressions. She had attended this service for decades, and the change in her seating position represented a public acknowledgement of her reduced status within the family hierarchy. The Duke of Gloucester's absence from certain traditional roles was particularly noticeable to palace insiders. For years, he had participated in specific ceremonial functions during the Christmas period, representing the Queen at various events when she was unavailable. This year, those duties were quietly redistributed to members of the direct royal line, leaving him to observe rather than participate in traditions he had helped maintain for decades. Behind the scenes, palace staff worked overtime to ensure that the transitions appeared seamless to the public while managing the complex emotions and practical challenges involved. The Christmas period had always been one of the busiest times for royal staff, but this year brought additional pressures as they navigated new protocols while maintaining the appearance of business as usual. The new year brought fresh challenges, as the full implications of the protocol changes became clear to the affected organizations and institutions. The Royal Opera House, which had enjoyed the patronage of several now-demoted royals, received a carefully worded letter explaining that while their royal patrons remained committed to supporting the organization, certain ceremonial privileges associated with their patronage would no longer be available. This created a delicate situation for the Opera House's development team, who had relied on the prestige of royal association to attract major donors and corporate sponsors. They found themselves in the awkward position of having to explain to potential supporters that their royal patrons were still royals, but perhaps not quite as royal as they had been previously. Similar conversations took place at museums, hospitals, universities, and charitable organizations across Britain. Development officers and fundraising professionals who had built careers around leveraging royal connections suddenly found themselves navigating unprecedented territory. The value of royal patronage had always been difficult to quantify, but these changes forced organizations to confront the reality that not all royal associations were created equal. The media response intensified as the practical effects of the changes became more apparent. Royal correspondents began documenting every instance where the new protocols were visible, creating detailed analyses of seating charts, entrance procedures, and ceremonial roles. The palace communications team found themselves in the difficult position of neither confirming nor denying the changes while trying to prevent the story from dominating coverage of other royal activities. International observers began drawing comparisons with similar modernization efforts in other European monarchies. The Swedish royal family had successfully streamlined their operations in 2019, removing royal titles from several grandchildren of the king. The Dutch monarchy had implemented comparable changes years earlier, reducing the number of family members who received state support and official recognition. However, the British situation was complicated by the unique role of the monarchy in British culture and the intense media scrutiny that accompanied every royal decision. What had been relatively straightforward administrative changes in other countries became sources of public debate and speculation in Britain, where royal watching was practically a national sport. The affected royals continued to fulfill their existing commitments while adapting to their changed circumstances. The Duke of Kent maintained his role as president of the All England Lawn Tennis and Croquet Club, but his appearance at Wimbledon would now be governed by different protocols. The ceremonial aspects of his presence would be reduced, while his substantive contributions to the tournament would continue unchanged. These subtle distinctions proved challenging for event organizers and protocol officers, who had to balance respect for long-standing relationships with adherence to new palace requirements. The risk of inadvertently causing offense or embarrassment was constant, requiring careful attention to details that had previously been handled through established routines. The financial implications of the changes began to emerge as budgets were adjusted and resources reallocated. The Crown Estate's annual review showed significant savings from reduced security costs, transportation expenses, and ceremonial expenditures associated with extended royal family members. These savings were redirected toward supporting the working royals and funding palace maintenance projects that had been deferred due to budget constraints. However, some unexpected costs also emerged. The need to retrain staff, update security protocols, and modify palace infrastructure created short-term expenses that hadn't been fully anticipated. The Golden Entrance itself required security upgrades to reflect its new exclusivity, while alternative entrances needed improvements to accommodate the redirected traffic from displaced family members. Public opinion polls conducted in early 2020 revealed mixed reactions to the changes, though many respondents were unaware of the specific details of what had occurred. General support for modernizing the monarchy was strong, but sympathy for the individuals affected by the changes was also evident. The palace's careful management of the narrative had prevented any major public relations disasters, but ongoing attention to the story suggested that complete acceptance would take time. The most poignant moment came during the Queen's birthday celebrations in April 2020, when the traditional Trooping the Color ceremony was cancelled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The scaled-back celebration that replaced it provided a natural opportunity to implement the new protocols without drawing additional attention to the changes.